Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Rachel Roth, Director of Grants and Programs at the Foundation for Financial Planning. I wanted to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded to allow for future viewing. During these difficult times, financial planning and advice for pro bono clients is more important than ever. To provide additional resources and knowledge to nonprofit leaders and financial planners engaging in this work, FFP is hosting a series of webinars. I'd like to welcome John Dauphiné, CEO of FFP, to kick off this webinar on using financial empathy to help clients achieve financial well-being and empowerment.
Great, thanks Rachel. Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. Really glad you've joined us today. And we're especially pleased to have our guest presenters, Dr. Timi Jorgensen, who is Assistant Professor and Director of Financial Literacy at the American College of Financial Services, and Dr. Michael Thomas, who's a lecturer at the University of Georgia and actually teaches their flagship personal finance class to about 2,000 undergraduates. So welcome to both of you. Really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your research with us. I have found it fascinating. I'm so glad that we connected, and I think it will be helpful to both our grantees and our pro bono advisor volunteers as well. I do want to put a plug in. If you're a certified financial planner professional watching this today and you're interested in volunteering, but you haven't signed up yet, we do have our pro bono plannermatch.org platform. You can find volunteer opportunities if you register there. And I also want to point out these webinars are recorded, and we list them on our Coronavirus Resource Center on our website, which is at www.ffpprobono.org. So please do check out those resources that are there for you. And without further ado, I will turn it to our two guests to tell us a little bit more about themselves and get into the content of the webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Thank you, Rachel. So Michael Thomas and I actually have known each other for 5 years now. 5 years. That's crazy to think about. We met when we worked together on a joint community engagement project where we administered financial literacy courses to low-income families, both single-parent households and dual-parent households, and they were offered kind of in conjunction with relationship courses as well. So we focused on economic empowerment in also adding these skills so we could have maybe a more holistic approach. So we were able to work on that project together for 2 years, and then we were students together. Then Michael graduated, and then I graduated, and now we're colleagues in this new phase of life where we're not students and we're getting used to it. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we're gonna kind of walk through this. I'm gonna walk through some things at the beginning, and then I'm gonna kind of pass the reins on to Michael, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. So there's a Q&A section in your toolbar. So if you have a question, you can go ahead and type it in there, and then we'll be able to kind of keep track of what's being asked and get to those when we have time for that at the end. So, all right. So just getting started on providing some context. When you're doing any engagement with a client, it's so important to understand who you're sitting across from or who you're sitting next to as you begin the planning engagement. You need to kind of have some context to go into it with. And most of us go into an engagement with some context, and it's really based on our expertise and our qualifications and the advice and the quality of things that we can provide for that person. But as we recognize that the world is full of people who have very different experiences navigating it, it's important to be sensitive to the fact that how other people navigate this experience called life is very shaped by what's available to them. And so the example we want to kind of start off with is, if you're sitting across or with let's say you're with a Black man, and you're looking at their income, looking at his life retirement plan, and you make the suggestion that he work until 70 or 71, and without taking into consideration that his life expectancy is 69. And not knowing that, what you've inadvertently just suggested to this client is that he work until he die. And so if that's the beginning, or if that's the recommendation that you leave it with, it's no wonder that people can say, this person doesn't get me, this is not relevant advice, that this isn't, they don't understand what I brought to them. Because for them, working until they die is not something that they want to think about. Obviously, for none of us are like, you know what I would like to do on my last day alive? Go to work. No, that's not our plan. So we just want to be able to provide some context through research, things that we've been able to figure out, and to be able to point out some nuance, as well as some of the universalities of financial planning and financial well-being. So what's kind of universal to all of us, because all of us have the shared experience of dealing with money. And then what's pretty unique for us based on our race or ethnicity or our gender. So that's what we're going to kind of walk through today. So right off the bat, one thing that we know is not the same is earnings, income, how much money we have to work with to begin with. This is very much still a gendered and a race-based experience for most people in the United States. So you can see across this that men earn significantly more than women, that white and Asian men in particular earn significantly more on average than women, particularly women of color, have a very low lifetime earning trend as you're looking compared to other race, ethnicity, and gender identities. This is from last year, actually, 2019. So this is from Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is median weekly earnings. So this isn't the average. This is the most common weekly take-home pay for full-time wage and salary workers. So this isn't looking at unemployment. This isn't looking at incarceration. This isn't looking at people who are out of the workforce to raise a family or to go back to college or anything. This is just people who are working full-time. So we see that the disparity still exists for those that are full-time in the workforce, not really trying to maybe juggle and do other things. So these are important things to just have as kind of background knowledge. So you can benchmark. We know that our brains naturally want to have like a shortcut so that we have somewhere to start from. So we kind of have this idea. And this information is definitely an average. This isn't going to be true for any one person in particular. It's because it's a combination of data points from everyone. What this does provide you is a place for you to start. When you walk into the room with somebody, you can say, I probably need to ask some pretty serious questions around like, what does your income look like? What's the stability of that income look like? And can you just give me some information around that, so that you're having the full story and have the full amount of information, so you're really understanding. This is part of data collection, so this is something you're already doing. But it is good to just have in your purview that there are pretty significant discrepancies, and that's an important part of navigating financial planning for a lot of people. The other reason that this is really important, and we feel really strongly about this, is because the country is changing. It's been changing, but the change is going to come to fruition much sooner than it has been. So we're kind of on the cusp of these big sweeping changes and demographic changes. And so as of this year, as of 2020, actually, fewer than 50%, so less than half of children born in America this year will be non-Hispanic white. So Caucasian children. As of 2028, we'll have the largest foreign-born population as a percentage of the country since 1850. As of 2030, all baby boomers will be 65 and over. So the baby boomer generation will entirely be eligible for retirement. That means 1 in 5 American citizens will be a senior citizen. we will shift from our population be increasing due to natural birth rate, and it will shift to be growing more due to immigration than to birth rate. And that's not because we're not having kids in America, it's because more people are old. So we're dying at a much more, at a higher rate, and our birth rate isn't keeping up with that. Also in 2030, women will control 2/3 of the wealth in America. As of 2035, senior citizens will outnumber children. So those 65 and over will be a larger share of the population than those 18 and under. That's the first time this has ever happened in American history. And also 1 in 5 senior citizens will be 85 and older. So that means we're going to have a really large, oldest old cohort. So the dynamics of being a sandwich generation person are going to be even more pronounced. We're going to have more people that are in need of sort of long-term care, and it's just going to be a really interesting dynamic for us to be navigating. As of 2045, America is slated to become a majority-minority country, meaning more citizens will identify as a racial or ethnic minority than as non-Hispanic white. We'll have the fastest segment of the population that's growing is going to be considered multiracial. That's how they'll self-identify, multiracial. And then among Asian American populations, immigration will be the population driver, where natural birth rate will be the population driver among Hispanic Americans and also amongst African Americans. And then as far as 2060, so 2060, 1 in 6 Americans is projected to be foreign born. 1 in 3 children is projected to be non-Hispanic white, and 50% of adults are expected to be non-Hispanic white. So this is from data from the Census Bureau, and I don't have the citation on here, but it is, I can include it before we post the slides. This was their population projections from 2015 to 2060. So as far as like what the statistics are telling us, what projections are telling us, the world is changing, our country is changing, and the change has been happening. It's something that's been in the works, but we're going to see a lot of pretty seismic and significant historical changes coming in the next little while that will lead us to a place where we need to be able to have conversations with people of very different backgrounds and feel comfortable in those spaces, asking questions and being open. So with what we've just talked about, the fact that the world is changing, the country is changing, the makeup of our population is changing, and we know that we're not all experiencing this financial situation in the same way. We don't make the same amount of money. We don't have the same kind of jobs. Our family situation is going to look differently. How do we go into this and try and achieve the same kind of goal? Well, I think the natural metric is going to be financial well-being. It's not going to be wealth. It's not going to be income. It's going to be financial well-being because it's something that's realistic and achievable. And it's really the pinnacle, because you can have money and not have financial well-being. You can have financial well-being and have, pretty meager income and assets. So that's kind of the gold standard that we're going for. Financial well-being, according to the CFPB, is a state of being wherein a person can fully meet current and ongoing financial obligations, can feel secure in their financial future, and is able to make choices that allow them to enjoy life. So you can have a very simple life, a very frugal life, and still meet these qualifications. You could have a very wealthy life and still meet these qualifications. That a lot of this is about how you think and feel about your current situation. So we're going to go through what I have called the inclusive financial well-being and empowerment model. This is something that I developed as part of my doctoral research, and it includes 3 dimensions. So first, you have to have access in order to be part of this situation. So if you want to achieve financial well-being, you have to have access to optimal financial products and services, including banking, including lending. You have to take some sort of action. So you have to be able to make those autonomous decisions with your money, with your financial situation. And then there's affect, or the way that you're thinking and feeling about your situation. So this is what the model looks like. And they're nested. You can see access is the smallest. It's kind of there. Access is required for you to take actions, but you can see affect is the biggest, because regardless of the access you have or the actions you're taking, if you don't feel good about your situation, if you don't have that confidence, if you're not satisfied financially, you still aren't going to achieve financial well-being. You could be making tons of money, have 100% access, be doing all the things you need to do, and still feel like I'm not doing everything I should, or, you know, I have too much debt, or whatever it is that's going on in your head. Or you could be thinking, when's the other shoe going to drop? I can't stop and enjoy this because something bad's coming. I just know it. I just know something's going to come and I'm going to lose my job, or I'm going to. So catastrophizing that future that you've worked so hard to achieve can take away from actually achieving well-being. And this arrow in the middle is labeled empowerment. So empowerment happens when you find the pain point for your client. It could be a problem with access. It could be something that they need to start doing as far as a behavior. And it could just be helping them figure out, how can I change my self-talk? How can I think about this differently? How can I approach my situation differently? So under access, access includes your financial knowledge. In order for you to make a positive financial action, you need to understand what is a positive financial action, what's optimal and what's not optimal, what's going to get me in trouble, what's going to help me achieve security. If you don't know that, you don't have access to the playbook. As Michael and I have talked before, you know, there's definitely a playbook. There are rules. If you don't have the playbook, you don't even know which game you're playing. You're just making moves left and right, and you don't really know where you're going. So understanding the basics, that's an access thing. Banking includes having access to a checking account and a savings account. Borrowing, for this research, I looked at if they had a credit card and if they had an auto loan. And then income shocks. This is another point of access, because without stable and regular income, it's very difficult to get into any sort of financial behavioral patterns, into making financial habits. If you really honestly don't know if you're going to have enough money next month, because some months you make enough and some months you don't, and you make enough and you try and do the best you can for 2 months or 3 months, and then you're out of money, it's really, really difficult to be able to set up those systemic actionable behaviors. Under actions, I looked at earning actions, which is really your work situation. Are you working full time? Do you take an online gig to make some extra money? Spending behaviors, savings behaviors, and planning behaviors. So these are pretty straightforward. Do you spend more than you save? You can hear my son knocking on my door. Savings behaviors, these are things like, do you save for your children's education? Are you saving for retirement? And then planning behaviors. So do you have a plan for retirement? Have you tried to figure out how much you'll need for retirement? And then affect, this looked at self-efficacy. Do you feel like you could go in and ask a question about a financial product? Is that something you feel comfortable doing? Are you confident in your financial management? Do you, how knowledgeable do you think you are? So what's your self-perceived financial knowledge? What's your financial satisfaction? And then the last one was stress. Where would you rate your financial stress? So this is things like, thinking about money makes me feel anxious. Talking about money makes me feel anxious and stressed. I have too much debt right now. So carrying that belief around, like, this is a reflection on myself. So all of those things are in under affect. So the culmination of this is financial well-being. So this is how this model kind of looks at it. This is just showing you what the population at large looks like. So this is, you can see under access, it's a pretty normal, what we would call a normal distribution, skewed a little bit on the high side. We would hope that everybody has access to financial services. There is one little anomaly you can see right here at a level 2 of access, which means of those questions that I ran you through, a large percentage, almost 10% of the population only had 2 access points. That means they either maybe only had a checking account and an auto loan. or they had an auto loan and a credit card, but no checking or saving account, or they had, any two of those things, or they maybe got 2 questions right under the financial knowledge and didn't have a checking account, didn't have a savings account, didn't have a steady income, didn't have an auto loan or a credit card. So this is a large percentage, 10% of the population really. It's here, between 2,000 and 3,000 out of just shy of 30,000 people that have very low access. So it's a pretty common situation for people to experience really low levels of access. If we look at actions, behaviors that are taken, again, we see there's a group of people who are not taking very many behaviors, kind of down here at the bottom, a little baby blurb of folks. And then most people, though, we see are taking around the same number of financial actions. So people, for the most part, are behaving pretty similarly, and it's on the positive side. They actually have kind of a high behavioral skill. So they're doing the things that they need to be doing with their money and with their situation. Then we're going to look at affect. So this is how people think and feel. And this large bar, I'm just going to call this out right here in the center. This is people who either are very stressed, but they're fairly confident, or are very confident, but have low stress. And this is men right here in the middle. Can I just, this is people who say, I got this, I'm totally fine. And then when you ask them how their stress level is, they're like, I'm confident, I'm satisfied, I can do this, it's no big deal. And then you ask them how stressed they are, and they're like, oh, I'm super stressed. Or I'm not stressed at all, it's fine, I got it. And they're right here in the middle. That's why there's this high bar. This happened across the male populations in the sample, which was really interesting to me, that this is maybe a little bit where we see overconfidence, where I'm totally confident. It's almost like my head's in the sand a little bit to some extent, like I'm fine, everything's fine, it's all fine, I'm not stressed. And so I don't know what percentage of this is just like people running through the survey and answering. We tried to correct for that, but you never really know. So just an interesting side point. So I'm going to walk you through in these next slides what I did for my dissertation research. Is I looked at all of these as across intersectional identities, which means there are 10 identities, 2 gender identities within 5 race or ethnicity categories. So white women, white men, that's 2 of the identities. And the reason I broke this up is everywhere in the research you see, particularly with financial literacy or financial well-being, you'll see women had lower financial literacy. Women felt routinely less positive about their financial situation, or more positive. It's kind of on both sides on the well-being. But gender is significant in almost all aspects of financial research. It's everywhere you turn. You'll see women feel differently about this than men do. Women behave differently about this than men do. Women know differently about this than men do. So I thought that was going to be an important thing for us to pull out, is to recognize that there are absolutely gender differences in how we think and feel about money, how we behave with money. And then I also wanted to recognize and give space for the fact that our race or ethnicity does absolutely affect how we experience this world. And particularly with access, I just knew this is something we know. Unbanked populations, African-American communities are far more likely to be unbanked than their white counterparts, even at the same socioeconomic levels. So this was something that I just wanted to see. And I had a hunch that people generally behave the same, that the differences that we're seeing are really largely due to lack of access. And that does bear out. For the most part, people are making the same number of behaviors, but levels of access, as you'll see, kind of are all over the place, and people feel differently about what's going on. So we're going to start with white women and white men. And as you can see, so the distributions that I just showed you with access, actions, and affect are in the solid gray back here. Then the checkered distribution is for that identity. So you can see the checkered distribution for access right here is kind of laid over. the solid gray. So women actually they still have high access, but there is a group of them that are experiencing lower access than the average. Women and men are both making about the same number of behaviors. There's nobody really in this white identity group that are in the very lowest subset of actions. For the most part, they're, running with the pack, doing about the same things that everyone else is doing. When it comes to affect, you can see men feel pretty significantly better about their financial situation. Their distribution kind of balloons on the far right side, and that means that their scores are much higher on average. And women are a little bit less. You can see they kind of skew a little bit more to the lower side. Access, I'm going to point this out. Access for white men is the highest of any group that we're going to look at across the 10 identities. It's so much further. It's so much higher. It's almost equal. It's almost ubiquitous. If you're a white man in this country, it's pretty much a guarantee that you're going to have access to financial services. And if you're not participating, it's very much a choice of not engaging with that opportunity and not a result of not having access to that. So next we're going to look at Black women and Black men. You can see that the access in these communities looks very different than it does in white communities. So Black women and Black men both have both of these checkered access scores show us a very different story. People are experiencing a completely different experience around access, much lower access experience. Interestingly, if you look at this actions being taken, considering how much less access they have, actions look remarkably similar. So this is telling me that people are trying, right? Regardless of who you are, what you look like, where you come from, what your job is, how much money you're making, people are really trying to do their best, and they're trying to do the positive behaviors that they know, and they're modeling and acting out on these things that they know will be good for them. You can see here on affect, though, Black women and Black men feel what they're experiencing. They feel less confident. They feel less satisfied. They feel more worried. Interestingly, when you look down into the nitty-gritty details of this, Black women, financial stress does not impact their financial well-being, which is very unique. They're one of just a few identities that have that as a defining characteristic. It's all about confidence, self-efficacy, and financial satisfaction. So for Black women in particular, and this is not the research, this is my anecdotal experience. A lot of this I feel like has to do with faith and resilience. It's like, you know what? It's been hard. It'll be hard. It's going to be fine. Like, we got it. It's okay. But when it comes to actually having the confidence that, like, you can do something else, you can make another action, you can see another option, it's not stress driving the fatigue. It's lack of confidence, it's lack of self-efficacy, and it's a lack of financial satisfaction with what's going on. For Black men, the stress was very much there. It was a significant predictor of their financial well-being. So that they feel the stress, they feel that traditional provider stress in a very real way on their financial well-being. I'm gonna just make sure I'm mindful of the time. So Hispanic women, Hispanic men, you can see it's the distribution under access, it's a little more concentrated for Hispanic women, but for the most part, they have pretty good access. Hispanic men have significantly less access than Hispanic women do. So they engage less prominently in traditional financial services. Hispanic women are actually taking far more steps behavior-wise. Their distribution is like a lot higher in the center. Not more, their actions and behaviors as a group are grouped much closer. So they behave as a group much more similarly. Same for Hispanic men. So this just tells me there are strong cultural norms, and most people adhere to those. So people behave in very similar ways to how they see their parents or their siblings or their aunts or uncles behaving.
Timi, just to interrupt for a sec, we have 2 questions related to this slide, so I thought it might be good to stop you for
Yes.
a second. Someone asked, what is the horizontal factor?
Yes.
And another question was, will you explain the reason for less access?
Yes. So the horizontal factor, these are those scores. So these are scored across the number of answers that relate to the most positive outcome. So under access, if you're all the way at the right side, that means you have a bank account, you have a savings account, you have a credit card, an auto loan, and a steady income, and a high financial knowledge score. So that's, you have all this access. Same thing for action. The higher the number of financial actions you're taking that are on the positive side, the higher your action score. And then for affect, the higher score would indicate you have less financial stress, you have higher financial confidence. It's like the best outcome is going to be there on the bottom. And what are the reasons for lower access? A lot of this has to do with just availability within communities. So if there's no bank within walking, or no bank that's on the bus line, or no bank that's within walking distance to your home, and you don't have a car, well, then it's pretty tricky to get to the bank. So people use what's available to them. They use what's closer. So they would use like the money services desk at Walmart because it's 2 blocks from their apartment rather than the bank that's 5 blocks away. It's also has a lot to do with actual denial of services. So when people go in to open an account, they may be told, actually, you opened an account when you were 19. You had an overdraft fee that was $36 for a $2 overdraft fee. And that was put into something that's called like the credit check system, which banks use to it's not a credit score, but it's a banking behavioral score. If you have a ding on that, they can deny you an account. So they could say, I know you're 29 now, not 19, but this other bank down the street said you were not a responsible person, so we can't open an account for you. And then you've got to remember, like, these are people behaving on behalf of companies. So a lot of this isn't done anonymously. So this is done in person, in communities. So wherever racial bias still exists and persists, this happens at higher rates because people are, and much of it, it's illegal to deny somebody who has the credit score and the ability alone. Does it still happen? Yes, unfortunately it does. Access sometimes also means that people are not seeking out access to those things. If it's a cultural norm not to have a checking account, you may just not go do it because you don't see the need for it because no one in your family has a checking account and they all seem to get by just fine. So it's a combination of things. It's really kind of a big question, but I'm gonna kind of run through these last 2, and I'm totally happy if anybody has any other specific questions or wants to see any more of this. There's if you're a data junkie, there's lots more where this came from. Asian women and men. Asian women actually had the highest affect among all groups of women. So Asian women were the most confident and the least stressed about their financial situation. So you can see this kind of bearing out in the graph. They really are we have this. Asian women, not surprisingly, also make the most money. So it would make sense that the group that makes the most money is going to feel the best about what's going on because they have the ability to make the decisions and the behavioral changes that they need to make. Asian men also experience very high levels of access. They make more financial behavioral changes than actually any other group. So they have the highest action score. And then they feel fairly stressed. So they have higher levels of worry and anxiety, but they do feel confident in their ability to act on those things. So just some kind of takeaways before I pass this off to Michael. When you're sitting down with somebody, particularly in a pro bono situation, you may need to start further back with them than you would think in a traditional planning engagement. So you may need to say, and this is how I've you know how you kind of find your language and you find your thing. When I sit down with somebody and I'm going to do a pro bono engagement, I just say, we can start anywhere you want. Just kind of fill me in on what's going on. What's your situation? They will automatically kind of pour out the pain points. They're going to talk to you about the hardest things or the parts that they can't figure out. They're going to say, look, we did this, and this is happening, and I don't know what else to do next. Like, I don't know, or I'm feeling really stressed about this. You can always follow up any part of this. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Before making any recommendations, it's always a good idea, particularly if you don't know this person, this is the first time you're meeting. It's different if it's like someone you maybe go to church with or have a mutual friend with, you could get some background. You may need to ask them specifically, what are your experiences with banking? What are your experiences with, accessing credit? What are your experiences? Like, tell me about your job. How stable is it? How stable is your job, would you say, on a scale of 1 to 10? So you can really kind of feel out and tease out what are going to be good quality recommendations that are actually helpful for this person. If you take the extra time to just, and it's not a lot of extra time, I mean, it's a few extra minutes just to ask these specifics, then when you give a recommendation, it shows that you were listening, that you get it, and it gives you the ability to give a quality recommendation that can actually help them in their situation, rather than maybe a recommendation that, although it was well-intentioned and may have been the best financial, most financially optimal recommendation, is not really available to them because they can't make that move. They can't do that thing yet. Not that they could never do it, but they may need to take a couple of steps first to kind of get ready to make that move. So it's also something that's kind of come to my attention as I've been working on some new research, is the importance of having a written plan. So when you're sitting there with this pro bono client and you're working through and you're dealing with this, tackling really just one small component of their financial plan, something that you can provide for them that's really going to cement things is an actual written out, this is what we said, this is the problem, this is how much the problem is going to need to be addressed, these are the steps 1, 2, and 3, and this should be taken care of by blank date. Having that plan to anchor to and to go back and look at and to go to you with a coherent question is so important in keeping people's anxiety down. They can say, I'm getting really stressed about this again, I'm going to pull this back out, I'm going to pull up that email, I'm going to look at this plan and say, okay, we're going to be okay. We may need to tweak this a little bit, but we can still stay on plan. That is really powerful for clients to be able to then come with a very simple question like, this came up, how would you recommend we tweak this part of the plan? Rather than feeling like I still don't really feel like I know what I'm supposed to be doing, which can happen a little bit. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to Michael. He's going to talk a little bit more about financial empathy and kind of the role of the planner in this engagement.
Yeah, awesome. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Timi, for an excellent walkthrough of all of it. I know it's a lot. So for many of you, I definitely want to encourage you to come back and rewatch this over and over and over again, because there are a lot of great nuggets herein. So what Timi was closing with really in terms of practical recommendations is really stepping out of ourselves and building bridges for our clients from where they are to where they want to be by being able to really step out of our mindset and to understand their mindset, and not just their mindset, but the context that drives their perceptions about access, action, and affect, which if you stop and you think about it, and I just want to pose this question to everyone who's listening, when is the last time when working with a client you stopped to really think about and to really understand, or better yet, empathize with, and we're going to talk about what that means, a person's perception as it relates to access, their perceptions of action, and their perception of affect. And that's a very different way of thinking when we're working with clients, because as Timi alluded to, when working with clients and having a written plan, one of the things that I've learned throughout this process is that when we create a plan for a client without thoroughly thinking through their mindsets about these things, barriers about these things, perceptions and actions about these things, what we're inadvertently doing is that we're not addressing the many barriers that lie between where the client is and our financial recommendation. So I often think about it this way. If you provide a client with a recommendation, usually that should be supplanted with 2 or 3 additional recommendations that identified any of these barriers that Timi was speaking to, so that as a client is working towards their goal, we have a strategy to address the things in the middle. And for the longest time, especially as it relates to neoclassical economics and things of that nature, we often thought about clients as individuals, as inputs and outputs, right? So if you know better, you do better, right? That's been the prevailing thought. But what we know about financial literacy in and of itself is that financial literacy isn't enough, because I can know what I need to do, but if I don't have access or confidence or the resources to act out on these things, that can actually induce stress. So being able to get to the root cause of these things and to be able to set appropriate expectations for clients as they're navigating their process in a very realistic way, it's important that we consider all these things so that we can build an effective bridge, which goes from, in many instances, a financial shame mindset, not just individual perceptions of shame, but shaming that happens within our society in terms of the narratives that we attribute to certain populations, when that can be entirely false. So financial shame is something that individuals deal with on a very real way that's both internal and external. And there's nothing better than to work with a financial service professional who recognizes that and actually sees context and can actually provide encouragement and support for what clients are doing, and to help them think through what are the barriers so that they can get further along in a process. And in doing that, that bridges us to something that we would like to call a financial growth mindset. So navigating from distrust to trust, from a passive participant in a process to an active participant in a process, and from being financially avoidant to being financially savvy and somebody who's willing to really engage in the groundwork and assuming self-efficacy and believing that their action will actually lead to something as it relates to their financial goals, hopes, and values and dreams. So the way that we do that, and actually let me click here. Tim, if you will click for me. That's financial empathy. And Tim, if you'll click one more for me. All right, so there are literally 41 in the literature. When we look at psychology literature and when we look at medical literature, there are 41 different types of definitions as it relates to empathy in general. I use this definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary because it's most encompassing of all the different nuances, and it is the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another, of either the past, present, or future. And I was intentional about including future simply because what we know about different therapeutic methods and the way that people perceive space and time. Some individuals are hedonistic, meaning that they enjoy life for the present. But we also have to be mindful that even though we have clients that know that they need to plan for the future, they actually may have a fatalistic perspective, meaning that even if I attempt to do the thing that you're telling me, it's never worked for my aunts, it's never worked for my uncles, it never worked for my mom, it never worked for my dad, my grandparents, so on and so forth. So why will this now work for me? So as we think about what Timi was alluding to earlier, this whole notion of access, whether that be being to the banking system or otherwise, at some point, something happened, right? Whether it was systematic, whether it's racism, whether it's a lot of different things that potentially could have occurred that then weaves itself into a narrative that actually places people into a state of mind where they accept the lack of access as being normal. So this is a very interesting thing when it comes to affect, because sometimes someone can think that they're doing the optimal thing within the context of their situation, their upbringing, and the financial socialization provided by a family, and actually on Timi's scale, perceive themselves to have financial satisfaction. So there's a lot of nuance in this, and it can work in the opposite realm. But understanding future dynamics is important as well, because some people are future oriented, and some people actually, again, have a fatalistic mindset, so that as we're nudging them for something in the future, we can actually be inducing stress. So if we're not listening to really understand and to know someone's context, to know their perceptions about access, action, and affect, doing pro bono work, we can actually be doing all the right things, but still inducing stress and anxiety in such a way that a person will not follow through on a recommendation, and they won't come back. And not only that, they'll share information with those within their social network that suggests that we don't get and understand their needs, okay? And going further here, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. What's also important to understand about empathy is that there's story truth and there's objective truth. When you actually look at different research on social codes, meaning that if you're higher class, middle class, low income, low class individuals, there's usually social norms that individuals operate in to survive where they are. And what we know about low income households is that story truth is actually a prevailing way to communicate ideas, thoughts, emotions, again, access, action, and affect to tell their stories. So in understanding empathy and understanding low income populations, I think it's also incredibly important to understand that story truth for some is actually the truth. And sometimes we just have to step back a little bit, actually listen, say, tell me more, and to tease out where this is going and why they feel the way that they feel. Timi, if you'll skip again. So when it comes to empathy, there are three types of empathy in the literature. There's intellectual empathy or cognitive empathy. This is perspective seeking. So a great example of cognitive or intellectual empathy would be a doctor, which is someone who comes in and they listen to kind of assess your pain and what's hurting you and where it's hurting you and why, because we're trying to understand the perspective of the individual in order to provide a remedy for the situation that they're going through. It's not emotional empathy or we'll just say emotional empathy or affective empathy, and that I feel what you feel, but I can understand based on what you're telling me what you're feeling and know that others have felt the same. And based on what we've done in our line of work, we found that this could actually be a remedy to that thing, despite me not actually knowing how you feel. Emotional empathy is where we have a strong connection to someone and their feelings. And the thing about empathy is that sympathy and empathy is actually conjoined together in a lot of the definitions with empathy. So you can either feel as, which is traditional thoughts about empathy, or you can feel for, which is more of this sympathy that you may have for someone. I don't actually feel exactly what you're feeling, but I hurt for you, but I don't know the depths of what you're feeling. Both of those actually are great modeling tools when it comes to working with a client, because you can actually mirror or show or demonstrate that I share in your suffering, okay? And then the last one is compassionate empathy, or empathic empathy. And this is where you either feel intellectual or emotional empathy, but it actually drives you to action. And action can be a lot of different things. Action could be that, you know what? I don't know enough about this population. Let me ask Timi, can I read your dissertation or your future research? Or I didn't realize this was as big of an issue in my community as it relates to homelessness and things of this nature. Let me go schedule some time to go speak with the homeless director about some of the issues that are happening and resources and support, so that I can educate myself on these things, so that I can actually pre-plan how I can serve these clients before they come to me with issues that already exist within my community. Theory of mind is this notion of the ability to attribute mental states to oneself and to others. The interesting thing about this is that we can all exist in the same community, but navigate within different contexts of our community. And if we live in silos, there's no way that we can really understand context, even empathize, or in some instances, cognitively think through why this might be an issue to begin with, because actually we're kind of distant, even though we're all together. Timi, if you'll click again. So the whole notion of empathy really is to listen to learn. And then when we look at the origins of listen or listening, listen was assumed that if someone would say that I listen to you, that means that you would also take action based on the information that you received from me. So we listen to learn so that we can start thinking about what may be potential action that can be taken. And then we learn to gather more information so that potentially I could connect to your experience, so that I can feel as, or I can feel for you. So this kind of evolves a little bit. And then once we get to connection, once we're connected in such a way to where I'm taking on, and not too much though, but taking on the context, the narrative, the issues that may be arising within our community, I can use my status, my education, my power, my connections, then to drive appropriate action for these people I've connected with, I've learned about, and I've listened to. This process very rarely happens from the inside out, meaning the inside of our offices, and then out into the real world. If we want to develop real empathy for the people that we're serving, we need to prioritize and schedule times to have an outside-in approach where we're not expressing our expertise or knowledge and things of that nature, where we're really simply just trying to listen to first understand, then to understand, to learn more, learning more to try to connect to, and in connection that ultimately drives to action. So Timi, if you'll click again. And that's, I want to keep it there, but I'd be more than happy to go into a lot more detail about empathy. There's a lot of research out there about it. There are instances where someone can be too empathetic, especially on the emotional side, where it inhibits them to be able to actually provide appropriate recommendations, or for a doctor to actually perform a surgery. So think about it this way. If you're a doctor and you're a surgeon and you're having to operate on your child, that would be a very difficult thing to do. In those instances, we wouldn't be able to do it. But the beautiful thing about empathy is that we're actually in a position where we can feel what our clients feel in some instances, but not have the flight response that our clients have. Because once we have emotions, emotions lead to thoughts and behaviors and things of that nature. And we have the beauty of being able to experience that and also be objective to help them navigate processes. So I'll stop there.
We'd love to hear some questions. You can type your questions into the chat or the Q&A, and I can ask them to Timi and Michael, or if you have any comments.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to address one that came in before. There was a question about what do we feel like could be done on the banking regulation and industry side as a response to COVID-19. And when we met before we met today, and we it's about a 329 is the average dollar amount that an American family spends on overdraft fees or ATM fees in a year. And so that's been something that we kind of identified as, might be a positive thing to reevaluate our increasing banking fees, not just as it relates to one population, but like as a country. We really can't afford what we're paying for banking. And it's, again, one of those playbook things where if you have the playbook, you know not to pay those. If you don't have the playbook, you don't even know it's an option not to pay those. And so it just becomes at $329 when you're making not very much money can turn into a big chunk of your income.
And Timi, just to kind of piggyback on that, if an individual is paying banking fees, that means that they're more than likely operating at a deficit. So these banking fees can come from a lot of different areas, not meeting minimum balance requirements, so on and so forth. But then we need to be looking at fees as it relates to other areas of someone's life as well, in terms of maybe being behind on other bills. Maybe it's as you're, living in an apartment complex or whatever it may be, or you have a mortgage and you have to pay fees on the back end of that, which some of that has been addressed through the initial parts of the moratorium. But the issue is that not only is this fee issue a big deal, but now we're dealing with deferred fees, an economy that has not fully ramped up, and people don't have the cash flow and the means to actually pay some of these balances within a time frame that they're going to need to pay these. So this is definitely a compounding issue, and fees across the board is something that needs to be addressed.
So we have two questions that have come in. The first is, what's the best way to connect with people in your community who tend to avoid money issues because of stress? How can you help when people aren't searching for help or who aren't aware help is available?
Yeah, well, for me, one of the things that I do that I'm incredibly engaged with local organizations, not just in terms of the people who lead and run these organizations, but also the individuals who come and seek the services of these organizations. So I think one of the best ways to get connected is to really take some time to thoroughly research who is in your community. What are they doing in your community? Who are they serving within your community? And either you can go meet with them directly and actually glean insight from some of the things that individuals are dealing with and having to address. Or you can actually go and say, hey, I'd love to come to one of your group meetings. I just want to sit down and I just want to be a part of it. I want to listen, or I want to be able to come and just ask questions about their unique experiences and what I might be privy to, what I might not understand. Even go as far as to say that in these types of settings, I would love to ask that question to individuals who generally don't want to talk about or engage with money, but this potentially could give you the space to go in and potentially to ask questions that allow you to glean more insight. The more insight that you have is going to lead to further questions that could either lead to research or solutions that have already been proposed that you may have never thought of before as an option. And then that leads to greater self-fulfillment and ability to serve your community and the state laws and the municipal laws and things of that nature in your particular area.
And I would just add to that, I think if they're not ready to talk about money, it's probably not your job to find them yet. Unfortunately, even people that really, really need to talk about it, if they're not there on the cycle of change, being willing to make some behaviors, being willing to open up about it, there's not a lot that you can do. And it can be really a stressful experience as the advisor to try and promote that change for somebody who's not into it yet. The other thing though, I think, is telling somebody up front, I'm going to take this next 30 minutes or this hour. This space and time is designated for you to talk to me about whatever you want to talk to me about. And just know there is no judgment. I mean, this is like not to plagiarize Planet Fitness, but judgment-free zone, we're to give them permission to talk about it and know that you're not back there thinking, what an idiot. For you to say that out loud and be very transparent with where your position is, I think can be really powerful. And people saying okay, cool. Well, if you're offering to listen, if you got an hour-long free consultation with a doctor and they said, no judgment, you just tell me anything you need to know, you might have some questions for them, that you would want to ask them. So being transparent and just being real, maybe admitting to some financial foibles that you've made in the past. I also have trouble budgeting. I also, have gotten in trouble before with credit cards. Just giving them permission to kind of share all the things that they might consider to be embarrassing.
And then let's try to answer one more question. This is really excellent information. How do we advise around lack of access? How do we help clients overcome the fatalistic mindset?
So I think Michael has talked through this several times in the past when we worked together, and even before. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly what's available in your community. So if you have a connection at a credit union, if you go to a certain bank, it may just be about, if you don't have access in your community, but you have a smartphone, let's open up and start a 0 balance required, no fee, no minimums, online bank account. You could set it up right now. We could figure it out. You can set your direct deposit up to it. It's just figuring out what's going to be realistic for that person. And then as far as fatalistic tendencies in clients, I think this is where your kind of financial planning Excel wizardry can come into play. If you can show somebody that like small, consistent behavior does actually make a huge difference over time, I don't think that's something that people get enough of. They don't get enough kind of cheerleading to say, even if it's $20 a week, do you know where that's going to put you in a decade? Do you know where that's going to put you in 2 decades? Then people are far more willing to start because they see what it can become, instead of just saying like, there's no way I can ever do anything. I'm never going to have that kind of money. That's really important for people to hear.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Sometimes I think that we have to move the goalposts because we use very generalizable recognition. We use very generalized recommendations for the entire population. So for instance, if I look at or I follow Dave Ramsey on Instagram, and I see that, you know, someone paid off $100,000 in 12 months. How do you do that? For the families that I work with, even middle class families, $100,000 in 12 months, or even to think about just the notion of a 3-month emergency fund for someone who actually is operating at a deficit on a month-to-month basis. Like, how realistic is that? So when we set expectations for clients that seem insurmountable to them because of the context of the situation of their lives, sometimes we have to make it okay to say, we're going to move the goalposts. And if you can just establish, and I've been encouraging right now for individuals, especially lower income households, to try to prioritize a 14-day essentials need fund, especially for those who are going to be sending their children back to school, because at some point in time, as we enter into the fall, you might get ill or your child might get ill, and that can be absolutely detrimental for that 14-day quarantine period. But that could be a more realistic and justifiable goal for someone to achieve. And once they've achieved it, as Timi had mentioned, then we celebrate it. And not initially go into what's going to be the next thing, but we allow space to say, hey, you've done this, you did this, I didn't, right? And then what happens is there's dissonance that's happening within that individual's life between them actually asserting self-efficacy and the perceptions of self-efficacy doesn't work, right? So that warring and wrestling starts happening. And then you also have to understand, if someone comes from a background in a household who's telling them, well, yeah, you did that, but you know something's going to happen, that means that our interactions with this individual has to be consistent to actually offset maybe these competing narratives that they're receiving in the context of their situation, which makes this a community effort, not a short-time, one-time intervention, but something that needs to be done sustainably over a period of time before someone really develops the confidence that they need to really walk and move on their own.
I'm conscious of time. We do have 2 more questions that if you have time, I can go through them. One is related, do you think online banking and apps will eliminate or reduce the problem to access? What barriers do you see with technology?
I do actually think that it is decreasing problems of access. The barriers with technology are, a lot of them are actually around like language. The app has to be available in multiple languages in order for people to be able to use the app. But for the most part, it's much easier, even amongst wealthier families, it's easier to get started on a savings account if you can do it on your couch than it is to actually take the time, go down to a bank, open a savings account, have to sit and talk with somebody about your money. People are just more inclined to do things when they can do it from the comfort of wherever they are. And then the only other issue is you have to have access to the internet. So there can still be a little bit of a barrier there, but we know things like Cash App and Venmo and GoFundMe are used disproportionately by minority populations, by lower income populations. So they really are filling a really important void in having accessibility and having mobility amongst populations. That's the ability to kind of share money and be able to send money when you have it and be part of a community is something I think happens at actually greater numbers in lower income realms than it does at higher income realms. So I think eventually there will be kind of a melding of the two worlds to some degree. But it's been very positive so far in increasing access.
Do you have a process that you've tested and can share with us, a language or a set of questions?
I mean, mine is, I always try and find something that we have in common, or I just think there's a lot about the human experience that is universal. So, I mean, right now, we all have this pretty common universal worldwide experience of COVID-19. So there's not a lot about being human that's that different. I'd say the human experience is probably 95% the same and 5% unique to whatever your circumstances. So I think when you, even just walking into a room with that thought and that approach of like, we're both people, I'm just a person sitting across from another person, we have different skills, we have different interests or whatever. I find family and pets and hobbies are very useful. I used to be a hairstylist. Those are the same three that I always used: family, pets, hobbies, because you can always find something that you have in common with people, or TV. I don't know. You can always find something that you can, bring it back and say like, we're the same with this one thing. We both love this one thing, or we both hate this one thing, whatever it is, you just kind of find something that you can anchor together. And then I found really, if you ask people just to start with what they want to start with, instead of you having an agenda, they will tell you 80% of the problem and the pain point without you having to ask any additional questions, which is ideal. You don't want to do the talking and a discovery. You just want them to tell you what's going on so you don't miss anything. And then asking that at the end, is there anything else you feel like I need to know or understand before I take this information and kind of mull it over and come back with some recommendations? They'll fill you in on whatever pieces you didn't ask yet and that are important for the calculation. They want useful help, so people will usually give you the information you need.
Yeah. And on the flip side of my end, I actually use a combination of cognitive behavioral therapeutic and solution focused therapeutic methods. And the reason why I use a combination of the both is because for some individuals, they can't move forward without exploring the past, or wanting the desire to explore a little bit of the past, or to set the groundwork and foundation as to why they are where they are. And that's important for them to hear it. For some individuals, they may come in and they don't even want to acknowledge or really recognize the past. They just want to move forward. So there's a vacillation between clients. I actually see this most prominently with couples, especially if they're having financial issues between the two. One person has been hurt in the situation or scenario, and another person did the hurting and they just want to move on. So what I've learned is that I need to allow the space for individuals to revisit the past where necessary. And it also allows some space to even nudge forward a little bit as well, given the context of the situation. So if you're looking for some different therapeutic methods to kind of look into that can prime you to be able to address both of those scenarios, not to be a therapist, but be able to ask meaningful questions in such a way to tease out the information that you need and the context you need to best help those individuals, I would look into some resources on cognitive behavioral therapy as well as solution-focused therapy.
Thank you so much, Michael and Timi. We've received very good feedback so far from all of these wonderful people that are commenting. We really appreciate the time today from you and all of our attendees.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Timi,
thank
rock
you.
star.
Thank you so much.